This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. EWA retains full editorial control over the contents of this podcast. This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In his new book, Disillusioned, 5 Families and the Unraveling of America's Suburbs, author and longtime education journalist Ben Herold looks at the evolution of a key component of the proverbial American dream, the happy life and opportunities promised by suburban communities. But what happens when residents, often white and affluent, move on, leaving behind tattered threads and poorly planned infrastructure for the next occupants, who are often less wealthy, African American, or Latino? Through this book, Ben Herold challenges his readers to wrestle with some of the hardest truths out there, including how white privilege shapes our society, how difficult it will be to change that, and why the fight is worth it. Ben Herold, welcome back to EWA Radio.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I was going to ask you what the origin story was for this book, but you actually sum it up pretty well yourself in your own writing. So I'm asking you, would you read your nut graph for us?
Sure. The question that really drove me from the beginning with this was, how are the abundant opportunities my family extracted from Penn Hills a generation earlier linked to the cratering fortunes of the families who live there now?
Penn Hills, it's a community outside of Pittsburgh. How did your family wind up there?
Because I was about to be born. They had been living in an apartment. My parents and my older brother was born, and my mom was in grad school at the time, and my father was kind of bouncing around, and he was interested in ecology and the environment, and working at a camping store and trying to figure out what to do with his life. And then they got word that I was coming, and so that led him to hunker down and take a serious job that he didn't necessarily want. And the job led to a house in the suburbs, which led in turn to the public school system in suburbia.
What was Penn Hills like when you were growing up there? What were some of its redeeming features or qualities?
The school system was really highly regarded. And for me, there were plenty of opportunities. I was in a gifted program when I was in 3rd grade, and I would get bored in my class. After finishing my work, I developed this habit of drawing on my classroom furniture. And instead of punishing me, my teacher actually brought in a typewriter from home and turned me loose. She said, when you get bored, you just get on that typewriter and do what you want to do. And I actually started a class newspaper. It was my first newspaper job. And, those opportunities kind of compounded each year that I was in the Penn Hills public school. So every new door that opened, it was like 2 doors more followed from that. So there was a lot of great things about growing up there, particularly for my family.
When we look at Penn Hills now, it's known not for its great school systems, but for its massive debt load. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's actually, what really started me on this whole journey that led to the book. I had started my career in journalism covering the school district of Philadelphia, and then went on to Education Week and was a national education reporter. And all of that time, I really felt like, the stories that matter about the American dream and about this kind of space between America's promises and its realities, particularly in the education system and particularly for families of color, that they were really rooted in big city areas and in rural places that we kind of forgot about. And so that was the mindset I had for much of my career in education journalism. And then I started to see these headlines come out of Penn Hills. And so the immediate kind of crash came when this kind of revelations came seemingly out of nowhere that this 4,000 student district had accumulated a $172 million debt. And it was just mind-boggling. And the things that followed from that, the ripple effects, furloughed teachers, cutting programs, slashing staff, doing all of these things that really diluted the quality of the education that I received, even as property taxes were going up, the cost of living in Penn Hills was going up, the value of homes was starting to stagnate. All of that made me say, hey, wait a second, there's something really profound happening in my hometown, and I want to know if my hometown is unique or not.
Well, just like actors don't break the fourth wall on a stage, journalists don't often insert themselves into the story. Did you know right away that your family was going to become, in a sense, a character in this book right from the beginning?
I had a sense that they would, but I didn't have a great sense of the extent to which we would need to be, and that I would need to really put myself and my own racial identity as a white man in the heart of the story. And so initially I kind of approached it intellectually. Like there was this interesting connection of me coming back to my hometown and seeing what the families who live there now are dealing with. But that quickly became really, really fraught because the mother who I got to know in Penn Hills is an African-American woman named Bethany Smith. And she actually bought the house 3 doors down from my childhood home in 2018. And so we got to know each other, and we started the process of reporting and research and kind of hearing her story and seeing how the schools were working for her young son. And very quickly, it became apparent that all of these kind of burdens, like financial, emotional, educational, that she was carrying were in some way connected to all of the kind of easy opportunities and benefits that I had received. And that wasn't just an intellectual thing. That was a really personal and emotional thing. And so that was when the process of really inserting myself and my family and my race into the story even more was a result of realizing, like, I can't just approach this intellectually. This is something that is really happening on a human level with me and this mom.
I want to encourage our readers to read this book because there's a wealth of characters and you follow 5 different families. So you've got Bethany Smith, who's this new arrival to your hometown. There's a white conservative family in the suburbs north of Dallas. There's a mom who's moved into what has been billed as this liberal enclave in Chicago's North Shore, and she discovers that it's changing very rapidly from what people might have thought it was going to be or what it had promised. And then a Hispanic family in South Central LA. Their parents are undocumented and their son is academically gifted, and they're trying to navigate those minefields for their family. And you also have a Black family in Gwinnett County, Georgia. I want to stop for a minute and talk about the Robinsons, because to me it seems like a really interesting example of there not being a level playing field, including on an actual playing field. And that's youth football in Gwinnett County. So how did you find the Robinsons?
I picked the communities that I wanted to focus on first because I really wanted to describe this arc of development and decline and the way that that gets racialized in suburbia. So once I kind of zeroed in on these communities that I thought were both representative and interesting, compelling examples of this cycle, then it was a matter of just, knocking on doors and going to meetings and meeting people. And in Gwinnett, I got to know a woman named Marlon Tillman, who runs a group called Gwinnett Stop. It's a school to prison pipeline prevention program. And so we got to talking, and she was helping kind of orient me to the landscape there. And she said, why don't I call some parents together and you can meet them and start to hear their stories. And so I met Nika during that very first meeting when, these parents got pulled together. And so she was great. She was just like, from my mind, everything a school should want in a parent. She's highly educated herself. She's super involved in her kids' education. She's funny. She's nice. She's just, has all of these resources that she's bringing to bear financially and socially and otherwise. So it's the kind of family that should get the same kind of opportunities and experiences that my family got in suburbia. But what they were experiencing, particularly when their oldest son hit middle school, was all of these kind of really disturbing problems with discipline. And so I met her right as that was kind of getting very fraught, this experience of, hey, we thought we were moving into a place where we could kind of set it and forget it, and our kids would get a great education and go on to college, and I can go back and get my PhD, and, we can do all the things that we want to do. But then all of a sudden, their lives as parents really got consumed with fighting the school system so that it didn't send their oldest son to the disciplinary school.
We've talked for a moment about Bethany Smith. That is her actual name. But for these other families, including the Robinsons and the other families in this book, you decided to give them pseudonyms, to anonymize them. Can you explain the process for that? What drove that decision?
The project really started to grow pretty early on. It was a sense of like, okay, this is going to be a significant story with a lot of sprawl, and we're really going to get deeply into not just the parents' personal lives, but their children's lives, including there's talk of special education diagnoses and behavioral issues and so forth. And so these are everyday families. They're just living their lives. And that was very important to me to tell this story through the eyes and experiences of everyday families. And so I was asking a lot of them, and it became clear pretty early on, particularly because their children were such a central part of the story, that it was the right thing to do to give them some level of anonymity and privacy in order so that they could tell their stories without having to worry that their children in 5 years would wake up and Google themselves and, find out everything that was in the story in that way.
And Bethany Smith is not anonymous, and there's a reason for that. I encourage people to pick up the book and find out for themselves. I mean, no spoiler alerts here, Ben, but there's a very valuable and important reason why Bethany uses her own name, and that is because you actually turn some of the pages over to her voice, which a really interesting decision. You talk about in the book how you wrestled through that, and I was really moved by that as a reader.
Yeah, it started because Bethany confronted me. And through that conversation we were having earlier about how the benefits my family extracted from Penn Hills are connected to the burdens that her family carries now, she basically called me out and she said, that dynamic is getting repeated here with you coming back and kind of getting my story, and you're going to, profit off it in some form or fashion, and I'm not. And she was right. There was no, two ways about it that she was right. And so it took months of us really having some really difficult and challenging and personal conversations to work through that. But what guided me through it really was that question that I said earlier, that core kind of question and thesis of how the benefits my family experienced and enjoyed were connected to the burdens that her family carries now. And it just became evident at a certain point that the best way to tell the fullest, richest, most deepest version of my answer to that story was not to have it be just from me. That having Bethany talk about that in her own voice, from her own perspective, would actually make the story in the book much richer and more valuable and more real.
Your characters have pseudonyms, as you've explained, but that doesn't make them to the reader less believable. They come across as very human, flaws and all. And I think I was surprised by the end of the book that I started to see how much these parents had in common in a lot of ways, even if their circumstances, their backgrounds, and the resources they had available to them were very, very different.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain level, all of the parents and families in this story are dealing with the same thing. So, one, they want what's best for their children, and they see education as central to that. And then, two, we're all, myself included, we're all kind of dealing with and navigating and trying to figure out this larger pattern, this larger kind of cultural and economic and political cycle of these communities kind of growing up and then changing very fastly and then deteriorating rapidly and being forgotten. And so what it was really important to me that for all of the families, for whatever their racial, and economic backgrounds were, whatever their political and cultural views and values were, it was important for me to try and communicate the world as they saw it. Then to put those pieces together and put those stories together and let readers kind of piece it all together for themselves about to say, hey, this is who I relate to. This is who I care about. This is who I'm troubled by. This is who I have questions about. And, I could not be more thankful to all of the families, for being so open and so willing to share not just their experiences, but how they made sense of them on their own terms, in their own contexts and worlds, and being open to that, not necessarily knowing how it was going to fit together with the stories of the other families I was following.
We're talking with Benjamin Herold, the author of Disillusioned: Five Families and the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcasting app. This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. Join them March 4th through 7th, 2024 in Austin, Texas, as they tackle the world's most critical social issues through the lens of education. Experience community-driven programming, unparalleled networking opportunities, and unexpected discoveries. Visit southbysouthwestedu.com to discover hundreds of sessions and events already revealed, featuring inspiring thought leaders in education. Register today. Ben, we've talked a little bit about what's in your book. I want to talk now about how you did it. The amount of data that's been analyzed here is staggering, including some fresh analysis you had conducted for your hometown of Penn Hills. I'm wondering, was there a moment when you realized the numbers and the data you were getting might change the direction of the book rather than perhaps reinforcing ideas you already held?
Well, I think I entered the project with the sense of, these dramatic demographic changes happening in suburbia. But I didn't really have a sense for just how sweeping and how rapid they've been. And so that's a big part of the analysis, is kind of just looking at that. And, I think the kind of kernel of that I still sometimes have to go back and reread myself, is that America's suburban schools, suburban public schools, are now majority non-white. And it just runs so counter to some of these deeply held myths and, assumptions and illusions that we have about suburbia, that sometimes having those kind of hard numbers and factoids, I think, is really helpful to reorient ourselves to what the landscape actually is right now. And from there, it was looking at things like the devaluing of houses and home values in neighborhoods as they transition to become majority Black. I worked with Andre Perry at the Brookings Institution and some of his colleagues to take this tremendous national analysis they had done and customize it to Penn Hills, and find that, in effect, Bethany Smith, this mom who lived on my old street, she was having tens of thousands of dollars knocked off the value of her property, which was her largest wealth generator, simply, straightforwardly as a result of racism. And then in the exurbs of Dallas, I worked with a wonderful professor named Magdalena Bennett, who's now at the University of Texas at Austin. And she actually looked at the tax benefits that go to homeowners and families in suburbia, particularly in places where you have these kind of strict exclusionary zoning codes that ensure that it's only high-end housing that's built there. And so, yeah, I felt really fortunate to be able to work with folks like them in the Education Week Research Center to put together this kind of quantitative portrait that I hope deepened and complexified the qualitative portrait for my reporting.
I have to say, as I was reading the book and I was watching the timeline ticking closer to March of 2020, I was thinking to myself, the clouds are gathering, here comes COVID-19. And I saw how it permeated the narrative and influenced some of the choices and very difficult struggles that these families and students faced, particularly when schools closed, when there was community upheaval related to how school districts were handling the pandemic. What did it do to your reporting process?
It shifted it online a lot, which was definitely a challenge, but again, something that each of the families was both gracious and creative in trying to figure out ways to work together. So I would actually FaceTime in on remote learning tutoring sessions or remote classrooms, or sit along with a high school student, one of the children of the Robinsons, for example, and they'd be at their kitchen table, doing online Spanish class, and I'd be on the side on FaceTime, kind of watching as it goes along. So there were definitely challenges, but in some ways, I tried to really lean into that because there was this kind of pedagogical and policy dimension to what was happening with this sudden shift to remote learning and everything that came with it. But there was also just kind of this human dimension of like everything was so weird and difficult and challenging. And so being able to be a part of that in a way that was weird and difficult and challenging for me as a journalist, I think actually ended up helping because it allowed me to communicate just how traumatic and unsettling that period was.
Before I was halfway through your book, I started to envision the people who most benefited from this suburban dream idea less as like pioneers breaking new ground in a new community and more like, maybe locusts who just eat up all the resources. And then when the field is stripped of every possible crop, they just move on. And that idea about this white flight is very much embedded in your narrative. And then you introduced a man named Charles Marone, who called this process something else. He called it a Ponzi scheme. And that's stunning, Ben.
Yeah, Charles Marone is the founder and director of a group called Strong Towns. And so he's a former municipal engineer who actually worked helping to build suburban sprawl, design, plan, and build suburban sprawl. And at a certain point, he was like, oh, wait, this is actually really, really destructive. And so he has started this really impactful organization that looks at this. And he was the one who had written about this kind of suburban Ponzi scheme idea. And when I saw that and started reading his work, it was like everything kind of clicked into place. These kind of human stories that I had been reporting, these quantitative analyses that I've been working with researchers to pull together. It was this idea of kind of the Ponzi scheme, or he also used the term slash and burn development. Both of those, kind of frameworks and lenses really allowed me to see, oh, wait, this is the big pattern that's happening that we are all a part of, whether we want to be or not.
And the folks who moved into these homes, certainly your book makes it clear that a lot of harm is done unintentionally and that good intentions alone aren't enough to move the needle. And there's this powerful scene you have with a pastor who's addressing, the school board in Evanston, Illinois, who you could argue are trying to do the quote unquote right thing. And he says we need to declare war on racism. It's not enough just for it to be about the schools. I thought that was really well handled. And I'm wondering what kind of pushback you expect or that you may be getting from folks who want to maybe dismiss some of these arguments as, you're trying to make this about white guilt.
I think part of one of the foundational reporting decisions that I made, particularly as it became clear that race was going to be really central to this story and whiteness was going to be really central to this story, was putting myself and my own family in there and really trying to carry a lot of that weight. Because my family did all of this too. My parents moved to Penn Hills in the street that we lived on without really thinking about it. They weren't activists. They weren't particularly involved in the community. It was like you buy the house, you send your kids to the school, and this bounty just comes. And then when that bounty stops coming and the bills for it start piling up, instead of paying for it and investing in that same opportunity for a new generation there, my family moved on and I moved on. And so part of what was, again, a moment for me, like kind of an aha moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I am part of this pattern too, was that when I realized that the gentrification that was displacing Bethany and her family from their really intact Black urban neighborhood in Pittsburgh, that was this wonderful community where she grew up in, but was being kind of decimated by this gentrification process, pushing her out towards Penn Hills. That timeline coincided very neatly with me leaving Penn Hills. And it was, you could not ignore or, avoid the parallel experiences that we were having.
Ben, I've been following your work for a long time, going back probably to WHYY in Philadelphia. And this is the most personal writing I've ever seen from you. Is it the most personal thing you've ever written?
Absolutely.
Well, that was easy. I'm guessing it wasn't easy to write.
No, this was a big leap for me professionally in a couple ways. So first, I hadn't done narrative storytelling at this scale before either. So I really almost had to learn how to, not just write differently, but to rewire my mind and my heart to encounter and experience and make sense of the world differently. And that was a long and arduous and very difficult process for me. I kept wanting to say, okay, I'm the detached observer, and here are the kind of the policy issues and the implications, and I'm the one who's going to make sense of the numbers. And that just wasn't working. It wasn't telling the family stories in a rich enough and compelling enough way. So I had to really learn how to be a better narrative storyteller first. And then on top of that, this whole piece about, bringing in myself and my family and my own racial identity, that was something that I had never done before. And it was scary and it was uncomfortable, but it became very clear that it was necessary to get to the place that the book needed to be.
You obviously had very candid conversations with Bethany Smith about the direction of your book. Did you allow any characters to read what you had written about them before you published?
There was no reading or prior approval of the actual manuscript or the words on the page. But there was a fact checking process that we went through that was a level of kind of detail and rigor that was, I'd say, exponentially more intense than anything I had been through before. And I actually had two independent fact checkers go through all 400 some pages in the manuscript. So every fact and date was checked, but also anyone who was named or their experience was included. There was the fact checker called those people, especially the families featured in the book, to say, hey, here's how this moment, this quote, this dynamic were being characterized. Do you agree with that? And so it was a level of fact checking that was both way more involved than I was used to, and also, working with an independent person who, I wasn't involved in that process at all, and it was important for me to step out of that and let the fact checker build their own relationship with the families, and that was uncomfortable for me sometimes.
Your book makes it clear, as we've said, that the problems and challenges here aren't just about schools, and this isn't something that can be solved by schools alone. But where are some potential solutions? I mean, what would success look like? Is it diversified suburbs with great schools, or is it something else entirely different?
Well, on the most immediate level, I think there's this question of how do we renew and reinvigorate this kind of investment in suburbia and its children that was made in the post-war era. And Compton Unified became this absolutely tremendous and really somewhat surprising example of hope and what that might look like. I think a lot of folks, and myself included, we don't really come to Compton thinking of it as a suburb. It kind of became synonymous with urban blight and urban troubles sometime around the 1980s. But it actually has this really kind of rich and problematic suburban history that dates back to the 1930s and 40s. And one example of that I was just stunned to learn was that George H.W. Bush, Barbara Bush, and George W. Bush lived there in the 1940s when it was an almost entirely all-white community. All of this kind of cycle of extraction and disinvestment and debt that we've been talking about as ongoing in these other places, Compton had already experienced that, and the bottom fell out in the 70s and 80s. And it really took decades for them to start to rebound. But in Compton Unified School District now, we see is really the kind of markings of this painstaking turnaround. And I spent a lot of time in an elementary school called Jefferson, following a fourth grade classroom there. And what I came away from that experience with was saying, okay, what Compton Unified is doing from top to bottom, from the superintendent and school board chair down to the principal, teacher, and the students and families themselves, is saying, hey, we believe that all of the kids in this district, nearly all of whom are Black and brown, many of whom are still learning English, immigrant families, and quite a large number of whom are either undocumented themselves or have undocumented parents, all of these kids have promise and potential and that deserve all the investment we can make. And so it was, I think, that mindset of investing in kids in a major, major way, but in all kids, that was very different from that original suburban vision that I think is part of what we can look at and learn from now.
Your book is getting early, strong reviews, including a starred review from Kirkus. Congratulations on that. I would even dare to say you might expect a rave from the editor of Up to Date with Room 38, but we know he can be pretty tough to please. And that's you. That was your student newspaper
That's
back
right.
when that teacher showed you a lot of grace, I think. And it's interesting to look back at that moment as a moment where your life could have, gone in a different direction.
Yeah, and it was for me. It was again putting myself in the story and recalling and remembering and actually really examining and processing these moments from my own childhood, but doing it side by side and kind of hand in hand with the families as they were experiencing things firsthand. It was both powerful and humbling. And so that experience I had of my teacher, kind of taking my misbehavior and turning it into not just a learning opportunity, but an opportunity for me to really kind of grow and explore and be creative It could not have been more different, for example, than the experiences of the Robinsons children in Gwinnett County, where it was every little minor thing, a few minutes too long in the bathroom, or, dropping the pencil and making too much noise in class. These really nitpicky things became opportunities to kind of enact this really punitive mindset. And so looking at my own experience side by side with the experiences of families and children of color really opened my eyes to just how profound the disappointment and disillusion a lot of families in suburbia have is.
What are some lessons or takeaways that you hope education journalists might take away from your book? Some ways it may inspire or influence their own reporting?
I think one of the biggest things for me that I appreciated about the opportunity to spend so much time and go so deep into what is at heart an education story like this was to have the opportunity to say education in schools happens in context. And I think a lot of times it's hard to do that when you're on the daily beat. But looking at housing markets, looking at land use patterns, all of those things actually tell you so much about what's happening in schools and why. So any opportunities to do that, to kind of widen the lens and look at what's happening at a community level, I would encourage. And one very specific example that was powerful for me that I'll share was looking at comprehensive plans. Every town, community, and city has some kind of comprehensive plan that governs the land use, population, services of that community. And that is kind of a guidepost to understanding all of these dynamics places. So I would really encourage that for one.
Some things move slowly, like book publishing, others very quickly, like American politics. I'm wondering, when this book goes to paperback, what do you expect to do, an update or a new afterward? What's changed in the time since you turned it in to now?
Well, I think that all of the issues are still very much alive and present. And I think we're seeing that in the news and headlines every day. These conflicts in suburban districts at suburban school boards have not gone away. They are ongoing. And I think as the presidential election cycle ramps up, we're likely to see a lot more of that. In 2020, we saw then candidate Trump working very hard to make suburban change a campaign issue. And it resonated with a lot of people. And I don't expect that to change.
Ben Herold is the author of Disillusioned, 5 Families and the Unraveling of American Suburbs, out this month from Penguin Press. He joined us from his home in Philadelphia. Ben, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Before we sign off for the week, it's been a big year already for the EWA Reporting Fellowship, which provides funding and additional support to journalists tackling important stories on the education beat. I wanted to catch up on some of the projects that have been published recently, and there's no better person to help us do that than EWA's own Angelina Liu. She helps coordinate the fellowship program, so let's give her a ring.
EWA, Angelina speaking.
Angelina, it's Emily. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me, Emily.
Oh, glad that you could join us. I'm hoping you can tell EWA radio listeners what's been going on the fellowship beat this winter.
Absolutely. Our fellows have done incredible enterprise reporting, and I'd love to tell you more about it. Kaylin Belsha, in a series co-published by Chalkbeat and USA Today, explored how hotel stays became a crucial tool for school districts dealing with increasing student homelessness and chronic absenteeism. Casey Chapter and Ariane Daly told a tale of 2 campuses investigating food accessibility at Florida A&M University and Florida State University. Their work was published by WFSU Public Media in Tallahassee and includes an 11-minute documentary. Reporting for Cal Matters, Adam Eckelman covers California community colleges' experiment with competency-based education and the students earning associate degrees by drawing on their lived and work experiences and demonstrating their skills instead of attending lectures and earning grades.
You also wanted to tell us about 2 reporting fellowship projects that are focused on teachers.
Yes, first up is Andrea Figueroa Brezeño of iNewsSource, who reported on the bilingual teacher shortage in California's San Diego and Imperial counties, exploring the availability of dual language educators in the rural and urban areas along the U.S.-Mexico border. Also, Kristen Griffith of the Baltimore Banner examined Maryland's Black teacher exodus. Why are they leaving? Where are they going? And what might schools and the state be able to do to stem the tide?
There's a great reading list already and listening list for our audience, but there are actually 2 more fellowship projects that you want to mention.
Yes, there are. Skylar Rispens investigated the promise and pitfalls of 4-day school weeks for the Montana Free Press, taking a look at how they impact teacher retention, student achievement, childcare needs, and food insecurity. And there's also Marcela Rodriguez of the Dallas Morning News, who explored how the recent Anti-Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Bill in Texas, SB 17, has begun to impact undocumented students pursuing their college dreams.
Amazing. And you can find out more about all of those fellows on our website, ewa.org, including the introduction of our brand new class of Winter 2024 fellows. Angelina, thanks for making time for us.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there for making time for EWA Radio. And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a good week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.